back to Cross Politic. I have on our show today with us Thomas DiLorenzo. Thomas, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
Let me introduce Thomas here, give a little background on him before we get into our discussion here. Thomas DiLorenzo is a professor of economics at Loyola University, Maryland, and a member of the senior faculty of the Mises Institute. He's the author of The Real Lincoln, Lincoln Unmasked, How Capitalism Saved America, and Hamilton's Curse, How Jefferson's archenemy betrayed the American Revolution and what it means for Americans today. Why is the history of Abe so controversial, and why does it matter today?
Well, one of the themes in my book, The Real Lincoln, was that apart from the whole issue of slavery, that's the one good thing, of course, that came from the Civil War, the ending of slavery. But there was also some revolutionary changes in our society. In that, one, the whole idea of the founding fathers of decentralized government, or federalism, as it was called, was pretty much ended by the Civil War, because we, the people, no longer have the right to nullify what we thought were unconstitutional federal laws, and certainly secession. The threat of secession was eliminated, by all the death, hundreds of thousands of dead Americans that lost their lives in the Civil War. And so basically, after the Civil War, the federal government became the sole arbiter of what its powers were to be through the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And, before too long, it decided that, there really shouldn't be any limits on our powers. And so the Civil War led to the gigantic, highly centralized, bureaucratic state that we've lived under all these years. And it's just gotten worse and worse and more isolated from the people. And then the second thing that happened during the Civil War was Lincoln's economic agenda for 25 years before he became president. He was a Whig, and the Whig Party stood for today what we would call crony capitalism. They wanted protectionist tariffs to protect mostly northern manufacturers from competition. They wanted corporate welfare for the railroad corporations and many others, and they wanted a bank run by politicians out of the nation's capital to provide subsidies for big business. Mm-hmm. That sounds familiar. It sounds like the Fed, doesn't it, with the bailouts and all that. And American politicians argued over these things from the time of Thomas Jefferson until the Civil War. And during the Civil War, all of this stuff was put into place. We had the National Currency Act, nationalized the money supply by creating the greenbacks, and we had the railroad subsidies started. And it led to one of the biggest political corruption scandals in history up to that point. It's called the Credit Mobilier scandal during the Grant administration. And we had tariffs on imports that were in the 50% range, basically until the income tax came in 1913. Wow. And so they had argued over this for years. And so all the farmers of America were really abused by these high tariffs, because what happened is if they were selling so much of their food, their agricultural products in Europe, not only Southerners, but Midwesterners and everybody else. But then if we cut off the source of income, we don't allow Europeans to sell their things here because of these high tariffs, they don't have any money, or much more money, to spend on American farm products. Mm-hmm. And so the American farmers for about 50 or 60 years were really abused economically by this high tariff policy. And that was all to curry favor with northern manufacturers and bankers who ran the Republican Party at the time, and the party of Lincoln. And so to the extent that today we have these problems of bailouts and unresponsive government, and a government that seems to be run by the corporations, for the corporations, mm-hmm, of the corporations. Mm-hmm. That all started in the Civil War. When
did the high tariffs start?
The what?
When did the tariff problem start? The
high tariffs started in the second year of the Lincoln administration. Mm-hmm. Before the Civil War, the tariff rate was 15%, the average rate, mm-hmm. 15%. And in 1862, it was more than doubled to over 32%. And then Lincoln signed 10 tariff-increasing bills during his presidency, 4 years. And by the time he left, the rate was up around 50%, 5-0.
Wow.
And it stayed around there, 50, so until 1913, when the income tax came in.
Wow.
Now, I think this is one of the misinformation at minimum that's been communicated is the war wasn't started over slavery. It was started over taxation, tariffs.
Well, your listeners can just read Abe Lincoln's first inaugural address online and read it carefully. And keep in mind, he was a slick lawyer, a lot like Bill Clinton. And so you got to take close attention to the weasel words that are in there. And if you read Lincoln's first inaugural address, he says, it's my duty to collect the duties and imposts, which meant tariffs on importers. In the very next sentence, he says, but beyond that, there will be no invasion of any state. So he literally threatened a war and invasion of his own country over tax collection, right in his first inaugural address.
Wow.
And in the same address, he bent over backwards to defend slavery. He even, near the end of it, he even endorsed a constitutional amendment to the Constitution called the Corwin Amendment, Corwin, that would have prohibited the federal government from ever interfering with slavery. And that's right there in the first inaugural address. Wow. So in that speech, he announces to the world in his inaugural address that he's going to do everything he can to put slavery explicitly in the Constitution, which it was not at the time. It's not mentioned, literally in the Constitution.
Right.
But at the same time, he threatened war over tax collection. And then when the Senate issued its war resolution, it said the same thing. It said this war has nothing to do with disturbing what they called the domestic institutions of the state. That they meant slavery.
Yeah.
But it had to do with saving the Union, they said. But why? Saving the Union for what purpose? Well, tax revenue. That was the purpose. It wasn't just the glory of the Union.
And that was stated in the war resolution?
Yeah, Lincoln said it himself, and then the United States Senate, he issued a war resolution announcing the purpose of the war. You can look it up on the web, and that's what they said. It's not our purpose to disturb the domestic institutions of the state, but to save, to preserve the Union and the Constitution and all that. But of course, in my book, I argue that they destroyed the Union of the Founding Fathers, because the Union of the Founding Fathers was a voluntary union.
Right.
Each state could vote yes or no, being a part of the Union. Mm-hmm. And I think if any of the states thought at the time that if they ever decided in the future to leave the Union, that the federal government would have a right to bomb their cities and kill their citizens by the tens of thousands, there never would have been a constitution. No one would have ratified that. Yeah. But that was Lincoln's theory that yes, the federal government have a right to wage total war on its own citizens if they ever want to leave.
One of the things you mentioned in your book that was really helpful for me was the whole controversy over slave states and free states. I had known previously that there was huge economic things at work, but particularly pointing out that the whole point of prohibiting slavery in certain states as new states entered the Union was not sort of preeminently or in the first instance because of this problem with the institution of slavery, but rather a vision for jobs for white people. And so there was the whole...
Yeah, so once again, I quote in my book, The Real Lincoln, I quote Lincoln himself as saying that one of the main reasons he and his fellow Republicans opposed the extension of slavery into the new territories, the areas of America that were not yet states, they were called territories, was he said, we want to preserve these lands for, in his words, quote, free white people. And so, in other words, it was a guarantee. The only people who had the right to vote were adult white males. And he was saying to the adult white males, if you move out there to the territories and become states, then we are not going to allow slaves or free blacks, for that matter, to compete with you for jobs.
Right.
Because all of these areas always also banned the immigration of black people. Illinois, the state of Illinois,
right,
Lincoln's own state, amended its constitution in 1848 to make it illegal for black people to immigrate into the state. And Lincoln endorsed that. Lincoln supported the Illinois Constitution when he was in the Illinois State House.
Right.
And so the second reason that they gave, that Lincoln and the Republicans gave for opposing the extension of slavery, is that the number of members of Congress each state gets is based on population.
Right.
And if you brought slaves into a state, that would increase the population, and it would increase the number of Democrats in Congress. And he was very explicit about that that's unfair politics, and that's why we are against this. And so there was no pretense by these people that there was some sort of hidden agenda to eventually, end slavery through the back door. Yeah. It was all politics.
When I was I went to college at University of Idaho, and in one of my 400 level classes, I did a presentation on this teacher actually assigned me to do a presentation on a political leader. Well, I thought Abe would be a great, fun presentation to do because I knew a lot of the history behind it. I'd read your book and done a lot more research beyond that. And I remember presenting on Abe Lincoln and telling my class that the war was not fought over slavery. And just even the gasp in the room there was people were surprised. And by the end of my presentation, I had a couple gals. One gal just said, "You mean everything that I learned about the Civil War is wrong? You're telling me right now?" and I said, and I just had a bunch of Abe Lincoln quotes. I wasn't even trying to, make this look like I was the one who was coming up with this idea.
Yeah.
And I just told her, I was like, I'm just quoting Abe. That's all I'm doing. And
so something the teacher should have been doing.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I tie this into, I feel like we obviously our history on the Civil War and Abe Lincoln has been drastically rewritten. I mean, we celebrate Abe Lincoln's birthday. He was in a lot of ways. I mean, his rhetoric and lingo was very racist, and yet
it make David Duke blush. The things
that's
he
right.
said about race relations. You can go on LouRockwell.com, a website that I write for, and look up one of my articles called "The Real Lincoln in His Own Words," and I just put together quotes from the collected works of Abraham Lincoln of his own racist, white supremacist statements. And you're never taught these in school at all, to be sure.
I'll make sure we can share that with our listeners.
There was a book written a couple of years ago called "The Unpopular Mr. Lincoln," and it's all about how during his own lifetime, this author says that he was the most hated and reviled of all American presidents during his own lifetime.
Wow.
And why wouldn't he be? And he suspended habeas corpus and mass arrested tens of thousands of northern citizens for opposing the war, for example. Why wouldn't that generate a lot of hatred? And all the deaths, as many as, now the historians are saying it might have been as many as 800,000 Americans who died during the war. Wow. And which, at a time when the population of America was about 10% of what it is today. And so it was only after his death that he was deified by the Republican Party and by the government in general and the establishment. And I think any American should be highly, highly skeptical of any politician, no matter who it is, who's turned into a god by the political establishment.
Right.
There's something fishy about that, isn't it?
You believe the war should not have been fought, correct?
Well, right. I think part of the subtitle of my book is the words "an unnecessary war." Because most people think most Americans think the war was necessary to end slavery, but they don't know that all the rest of the world, including the New England states, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, all these places, ended slavery peacefully without a war. No, it was only in the United States where the ending of slavery was associated with a war, and especially a war that killed hundreds of thousands of people and cost billions of dollars 150 years ago. And so it was unnecessary if ending slavery was the purpose of the war. But if the purpose of the war was to end once and for all the voluntary union of the Founding Fathers and the system of federalism, well then, yeah, the war was necessary to do that.
Right.
And to centralize all political power in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
The war was necessary to do that.
I thought it was really telling where you point out, the northern's portion of the war cost was about $6.6 billion, and pointing out the fact that they could have bought the freedom of every single slave and, like, would you say something like 40 acres for every slave?
Yes, that's true, and that's just the money cost, and then the cost of 300,000 dead Northerners,
right.
And who would never have children, and they never have families, they would never contribute to society,
right,
and all that thing. The cost is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Again, there are no numbers big enough to come up with a number on a cost like that,
right.
And so by doing what the English did, the English freed all the slaves by buying them
right.
from slave owners, and then ended slavery legally
right.
at the same time. And that way, they bought the position, and there's not the most ideal thing in the world. It's anyone would think it's odious to give tax dollars to some guy who owns a slave. But if the alternative is mass death in a war and billions of dollars of cost of a war,
right.
then it's a preferred solution, and that's why all the rest of the world did it that way, except for us.
I was talking a little bit with my 11-year-old son as I was reading your book the last couple days, and I was asking him about what he knew about the Civil War and Abe Lincoln, and we were just bantering, just trying to draw out, trying to get him to think about some of these themes. And but I'm curious what you think. I put the question to him. I said, if what do you call it when somebody says basically, if you can't leave, and if you try to leave, I'll kill you. And my son said a hostage, and I said
slave.
Or a slave, right? And so I just kind of I hadn't quite put it together in my head that until I was trying to talk to my son about it, but like realizing the cost of freeing slaves was not only 600,000+ deaths in war, but also the creation of everybody effectively became slaves to the federal government.
There's a book by a historian named Jeffrey Hummel, and his book is called "Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men." And the second part of it is about how the government became an enslaver of all of us after the Civil War, with all of its controls and regulations and the powers.
Wow.
So one of our goals of Cross Politic is we're Christians, and we want Jesus' name to be over everything. we want the Lordship of Christ to be proclaimed through the president's lips. We want every knee to bow to Jesus because we believe that Jesus was the answer to slavery, the gospel, and ending slavery rightly, and then apply that to our. The reason why I don't think we should go to war over abortion is because it's a national sin that the gospel needs to deal with. And this goes back to maybe one of my earlier questions about shame. The only we need to look back in our history and deal with our history rightly, repent of where we've gone wrong in the past, so we can deal with our current problem of shame right here, right now.
A good place to start would be to quit idolizing a man who never became a Christian, according to his own wife, Abe Lincoln.
Yeah, right. What do you think? I mean, you think about I mean, we have a lot of sympathy. I think we're really close in terms of like politically. You start idolizing a man, but that's related to idolizing money, idolizing government, idolizing all these things. There's obviously a lot of practical ways in which you try to convince people of the truth of history and how it would be better to decentralize power and so on. But it seems like, going all the way back to people like de Tocqueville and other people who came and looked at the American experiment, they said and saw that there was something spiritual about the American people. There was something about the American people that held them together that was deeper than just common practical goals. But they had a common commitment to God, to Scripture. They had a common worldview, and it was out of that worldview that they created the America. What do you think? I mean, in terms of these, our current day. I mean, we're so deep in this pit. What are some of the deep worldview things that have to change in sort of the American heart to get us to turn away from what we've done?
Yeah, well, we have to recognize that Americans are not the same as the government. Too many people equate the nation with the government, and the government is all governments have always been at war, so to speak, with civil institutions like the church, because if God is your sovereign, well then Hillary Clinton is not.
Right.
Or pick your politician.
Right.
And so all governments have always been at war. That I was just reading this morning. An old friend of mine, Gary North, wrote an article on BlueRockwell.com, which I write for, about how the federal government now is sort of waging a political war against private Christian schools because so many of the inner city public schools are so horrible that low-income parents are scraping up every penny they can to get their kids out of there and sending them to small, very small, mostly private Christian schools that don't charge a huge tuition, and this is an impending calamity for the teachers' unions because their revenue source is drying up.
Wow!
If these people are moving out, they're no longer paying any kind of taxes, and their students are leaving, and and federal and government subsidies to the public schools is based on student attendance, and so they're now they're going to have a waging war, so to speak, political war on private Christian schools. And this is nothing new. The government has always done that. So the big change is the growth of government. The Americans were, as you said, in the days of Tocqueville, very different people. But government, for 200 years has done everything it can to stand in the way of us just behaving peacefully and cooperatively with each other.
Well, I think we've gone over your time and would love to talk another 30 minutes. But I think we need to let you get back to your Florida weather there.
Okay, I'll give you one more tip, book recommendations for your young son. Is I have a book coming out on July 18th called The Problem with Socialism, and it's aimed at the millennial generation, so many of whom seem infatuated with Bernie Sanders and the idea of socialism in general.
Right.
And I think that's a horrible thing for America. And so I wrote a book written in plain language for that generation. It's called The Problem with Socialism. It's on Amazon already.
Wonderful.
So we can buy it on Amazon already?
You can get it on Amazon now, and it comes out July 18th.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Okay, you're welcome. Have a good day.
Thanks, Thomas.